So this is one of those topics which, when it was put into patron suggestions, I thought, that's not frigging possible. It's just not. There is no way such a treaty would ever happen. There's no way any treaty would happen under those circumstances, because why would Teddy Roosevelt want a naval treaty? And then I thought, well, there might be a way. But then I thought, well, I can do a two-part video with the Shameless book plug in the middle. And the first part can be about why there wasn't a naval treaty in the run-up to World War One, why nations weren't prepared to do it. And the second part, after the Shameless book plug, can be, well, there is a small smidgen of a chance of something of a naval treaty scenario, but it won't be like the Washington or London naval treaties. It'll be a very different treaty in many, many ways. And you have to understand that because of what I'm going to spend the first half of this video pretty much telling you to do, there is a very small sliver of a very limited naval treaty which is possible. And there really isn't much a scope for any more, because of the personalities you're dealing with and who you're going to have to be dealing with and being involved. And that's the really, really big problem. There's also the fact that the Dreadnought race at this point is laid down in 1909. We have the Orion class, the Florida class, the Kaiser class, and the Kawachis. And that's just 4 powers. So realistically, a lot of the ships we actually associate with the Dreadnought race, the ships which are the real meat and potatoes of it, are just beginning or have not even started to begin yet. So not talking about Queen Elizabeth class. So not talking about King George V's. We're not talking about any ships really of what we call, what we think of as the core of the battle fleets of World War One. We're still very, very much dealing with Generation 1. Sometimes Generation 0.5 rather than Gen 1 in terms of the Kawachis. It's a whole different world from what we normally expect, and it's 1909. That's the thing, it's 1909, 1910, a naval race in 1909, 1910. Why wasn't the great naval races of this period, and we've got the quantitative one, which is the famous one, which is between the Anglo-German naval race. But you've got a qualitative one, which involves pretty much everyone but the Germans. And there's a reason why the Germans aren't really in the qualitative one. There's a reason why they're always dragged kicking and screaming to the next evolution of battleship. It's because of the whole cost scenario they've got on, and we'll get into that. But realistically, they can't afford to be in both the qualitative and the quantitative one without cutting funding for the army, and that's politically never going to happen in Germany in this time period. So, yeah, that's why they are always jumping up behind everyone else. But the qualitative one, that's America, that's Italy, that's Britain, of course, but that's Japan, occasionally Austria-Hungary, and occasionally the South Americans and secondary powers like the Ottomans and Greeks get involved because they order something super and spectacular. And that's all fun and games. But what's really interesting about the qualitative one, and this is the really crucial part of the reason why it doesn't have the same heat as the quantitative one between Britain and Germany, is if you look at the ships, half the time they're using British boilers and Italian this and American this, and even if they're British, even if they're American, even if they're Italian or Japanese, half the times they are basically battlefield hot rods in some regards, in terms of, yeah, well, to get really the best shit, we had to get, a Parsons turbine. But, we live, we learn, we laugh. And that's because what was important in the qualitative race was saying how good a battleship you had. Honestly, it was the nation-state equivalent of mine's bigger than yours. That simple. That weird. But the thing is, in 1909, that hasn't really started yet. Yes, the Royal Navy's on their second generation, starting with the Orions. They are starting in on their second generation of dreadnoughts. Yes. But Dante Alighieri's only just been laid down, and she's the first generation of the Italians. The Japanese haven't even laid down a dreadnought yet. The Americans are laying down ships which frankly have those horrendous cage masts. And the Germans are just about getting out of the hexagonal layout to discover super firing. And that's not a bad thing. They've developed some good ships, but still, their ships have kept to a pre-dreadnought mold of arrangement for a long time. And then we've got Teddy Roosevelt in 1909. The man is partially through starting off his successor, William Howard Taft. He is literally stepping back from public life. He is a man who has built a navy, who has sent off the Great White Fleet, who has done all those amazing things for American sea power. One has to wonder why he would want a treaty in this time period. Honestly, historically, there is no way. No scenario realistically you can really push for him pushing it, but there is an option, but it's a very small option. Has to do with some of the other characters involved. Roosevelt is a powerful advocate for the Navy. I think it's a shame he didn't decide to stay in the presidency longer. He decided to go, because I think he was a good president, and I think while you have the incumbent advantage, it is an advantage for elections. And considering Taft won on a platform which is not too dissimilar to Continuity Roosevelt, although once in power he reneges on Continuity Roosevelt as far as Roosevelt's concerned, it suggests to me that Roosevelt could have won in 1909 himself. And that does set up a whole array of possibilities. It really does. He's an experienced leader at this point. He has established himself on the world stage. He's one of the world's statesmen. He is probably the first American president who is really a world statesman in the form that we would understand him to be today. Please note that phrasing. In the form we would understand today. You see, when we talk about world statesmen in the earlier period, they could have communications, but they won't have gone and visited places. They wouldn't be sort who would turn up to grand conferences and make a speech. They wouldn't deal with the press and be communicating with each other through the press rather than necessarily just direct communication. Having to manage the displays of their force, the imagery in the press, and their words, both personal and public. That's a whole level of action. That's Julius Caesar grade manipulation. Yeah. All of those who had to read his Gallic Wars, you will know the pain of reading all that propaganda. That is why throughout history people have such a great opinion of Caesar. Because he managed to write the first draft and the draft which kept being repeated of it. Winston Churchill could only dream of doing that. He wrote the first draft. He didn't get to write the continuous and only draft. So, the American government in 1909. Now, the thing is, top there, we have, of course, Roosevelt. Then we have Taft. Taft is a little less prone to spending money than Roosevelt in many regards. Then we have the naval secretaries. Now, naval secretaries are always curious beasts. They really are in American history. And the top one is Truman H. Newberry. That's the guy at the top, who Roosevelt had at the end of his presidency. And then below him is George Meyer, who took over when Taft came to power. Now, you also have Senator Benjamin Tillman. Yes. Now, whenever I talk about him, I have to explain that no, just because I'm talking about him doesn't mean I like his politics. He is an a-hole. He is a Democrat of the South of his generation. That is the only way to describe him. But he is also head of several key committees and has some more political favours. He is that period's equivalent of Charlie Wilson, the senator who managed to make the war in Afghanistan viable by calling in favours. He is able to get people to do what he wants them to do in politics, and he wants to build ships. Why? Because he wants Charleston Navy Yard to have plenty of work. And he's important if you're going to get the Democrats and the Congress on side to support a Republican measure. He's your best avenue for anything if you were going to try getting anything through. And then you have Rear Admiral Richard Wainwright, who is the first aide for naval operations. Senior naval officer of the US Navy in this time period. The forerunner role of the Chief of Naval Operations. He served in that job from December 1909 to December 1911. And you couldn't have really had a better person to establish the US Navy at the beginning in that scenario. But honestly, I think his moustache might have done most of the work, because his moustache certainly helped him fit in the Republicans far better than tashless Tillman there. Now, both these governments are not exactly prone to the idea of international agreements which are going to bind their hands. Not in terms of procurement of ships. They are juggling an emerging United States, an emerging industrialization. They're getting their infrastructures finalized, they're getting everything organized, they're actually getting their industry to mature to the point it's working. This does not make them fertile ground for a naval treaty. Not a single one of these men would honestly want a naval treaty. And a couple of them will probably shoot you over it. I think you could probably manage to outrun Newbury and Meyer. I think Taft just couldn't be bothered. Wainwright could probably consider you an idiot, and so not bother. But I'm fairly sure that Roosevelt and Tillman, if you suggested to them putting in a naval treaty and cutting funding for the Navy, in one case therefore cutting funding for his shipyard, in the other case cutting something he passionately, fervently believed the US needed, I wouldn't be surprised if either of those took a shot at you or at least punched you. And it makes sense to start the Americans, because the American government are who we're looking at to be starting this off. Because there is really not much chance of Roosevelt managing to get this to work after March the 4th, 1909. So if this is starting in 1909, it would have had to have happened before Taft became president. Before Taft took over. That's the only option. Taft is even less inclined. He doesn't want to do massive naval spending, but he really doesn't like international relations. Taft is a respectable mind as president. There are far, far worse US presidents out there than Taft. But he's also not an engaging mind. He can give a good facsimile of one, but he isn't truly an engaging mind. He's not Roosevelt. He's got his strengths, yes, and I know there are people who are historians who I work with and people I follow on Twitter who are obsessed with Taft and who call him their boy and who love him. And every time I see those quotes and those sessions, I do wonder for their mental health. But that's because I'm a nice person. Nastier people might wonder about other things. So then we've got Britain. Oh goody, Admiral Fisher's here. So whilst you'll laugh at the idea of any circumstances where Admiral Fisher accepts such a naval treaty, or any form of naval treaty, without first committing Harry-Kiri on every single person involved here, let's consider who the options are. There's King George V. Not exactly a man inclined to naval treaties. He believes in the full and righteous power of the British Empire. Fully and righteously. Then we have Herbert Henry Asquith. This gentleman. Again, not much skin on him, on his nose. He certainly wants a strong navy. He would like to save money on the navy. Like to have it cheaper. But he's also not going to commit political suicide. We are talking about people who eventually get bamboozled by the "We Want 8 and we won't wait" campaign into doing an agreement with the between the Treasury and the Admiralty, whereby the Admiralty get to lay down 4 and 4 more. The 4 more are criteria if the Germans lay down any ships. The Germans, of course, laid down some ships. The Admiralty got 8. The Admiralty had been asking for 6 ships. The Treasury had been wanting 4. They ended up giving them 8. That's a compromise and a half. So let's consider, and then we have Reginald McKenna, who is as efficient and effective a First Lord of the Admiralty as you're likely to get in this period. These are 4 men who ardently believe that Britain's place in its world is based in its naval superiority. These are 4 men who have literally staked their lives on that naval superiority. For empire, for their nation, for their service. I mean, the reason you're not going to get a naval treaty in this period is because even if you could get America to sign up to it, and that's a frigging long shot whether you've got Roosevelt or Taft as president, how do you do a naval treaty when the largest naval power won't sign up to it? It's kind of like when we look at some of the modern treaties today and America's not signed up to them. How much do they really affect things? How much power do they really have behind them? If the world's... I know today it's a superpower, but in this period we're talking a global power, and the premier global power, the first amongst equals of the world powers, doesn't want to be part of it. And for Britain, they're going through many things. I've already discussed when this video comes out. I've already discussed this week about the construction and the way they're forming their naval college, the way they've been getting the naval war college going at Greenwich, the way they've been investing in and started already investing by this point in the infrastructure which is going to lead to the oil fleet. There is so much being put in here already. It's just... it's not really a likelihood, is it? Fisher is one of the most arch political operators you've got, and the king is firmly behind him. So to get him on board with a naval treaty would take something exceptional. And this is where I think, one of the big things about naval treaties really wouldn't happen. Britain would not accept the ratios, and certainly prior to World War I would not accept equality with anyone. So I think any ratio, if you're looking for the later discussion, is out of the door straight away, not an option. There is no ratios. There's no limitations. Britain is operating on a 2-power standard, pretty much for most of this period still, and even when they're not officially operating on a 2-power standard, look at how many frigating dreadnoughts they built. This is a navy which doesn't take its full strength to the Battle of Jutland, yet still turns up with more dreadnoughts than the Germans bring. Royal Sovereign types, that's pre-dreadnought battleships. Battleships and dreadnought battleships and battle cruisers all combined. The Royal Navy has more dreadnought battleships at Jutland combined than the entire German heavy forces. So we're getting into cruisers and destroyers. And I know, I did a whole video about that. And they have that not because they are mildly keen on naval power, not because they believe in spending money wastefully. No, they are spending money because they think it's essential to their entire national survival. You want to persuade these people without the horror of World War I, without the political trauma that causes to the ruling classes, you want to persuade them to have a naval treaty? We have Japan. Again, not possibly quite so abusively verbose as Fisher's going to be, but the Chief of Staff of Navy at this moment is a guy called Togo Hayachiro. Again, you want to argue with the winner of the Battle of Tsushima that he needs to stop building a navy? That Japan should accept its position? That that they should lock themselves into their ships and not build the latest, greatest things they can afford to build? The Minister of Navy is Viscount Sato Makoto, and pretty much he is Hayachiro's man. He's going to do exactly what Hayachiro tells him to. He is in absolute awe of the man. And quite rightly, he should be. The Prime Minister is Marquess Katsuo Taro, who is a lifelong army officer, militarist, and ardent believer in those things. And Emperor Meiji, well, as much as he is a modernizer, and he is a modernizer, as far as Japanese emperors go, and is increasingly in favour of the Japan advancing, one of those advancements he likes is naval power. Again, look through this lot. Think about Japan's position in the world. Think about the Battle of Tsushima. Think about the fact that their fleet contains so many former Russian ships. Think about what we are talking about. This is a nation which has not long ago fought a war that it considered was for its survival on the world stage, and has established itself as an international power thanks to naval power, thanks to the Navy, thanks to the forces building up. An island nation who sees its security, its sovereignty, its ability to survive in a world of empires to be resting upon its naval strength. At least in significant part. And whilst, yes, the Naval Treaty does potentially offer them some chances at the moment, they are very much in the building up phase of capabilities. They're very much in the growing phase of capabilities. What kind of treaty would they get? What kind of position would they be recognized with? And things start to get worse from here as we go on. Because whilst you have the French government in 1909 is it's not the messiest government in this period. It isn't. I'm not gonna claim it's the messiest government in this period. That's by far the Austro-Hungarians, but who it is such a mess of political infighting and political debates and different powers and presences across the Austria and Hungary that, we'll get into that in a second. But France, at this point, which is still recovering from the humbling of the Franco-Prussian War, France, which is building up its strengths, which is looking at the Italians, the Austrians in the Mediterranean, is looking at the Germans on its border and its coast, which has a global empire to defend, France, which some days a week can't even agree which government it has for the next 5 minutes. You have, interesting scenarios of prime ministers win elections. They may or may not be allowed to remain in government. Just because you win an election doesn't mean you should govern. Just because your party wins an election and you have the largest party and you think you successfully won, you can form a coalition, doesn't mean that coalition is going to stay and going to stay in government. No. No. Why should you believe that? It's a permanent coalition. It's a permanent coalition. And so, yeah. That's the French. And they are even worse. They are in 1909 looking at a navy which is honestly lagging behind. In the second half of this video I plan on talking through the various battleships that are available at different points, and frankly the French fleet at this time is just... oh my lord. It's honestly traumatic to think about. Their best, most viable battleships they have are the Dantons. The Dantons. For fighting dreadnoughts. That's what they have. It's 3 years after the dreadnought was launched and commissioned. 4 years after, and they have done nothing. They have got nothing going on yet. Even the Russians are ahead of them. Even the Russians are ahead of them. Speaking of which, we've gone to the Italians, but it's worthwhile talking about them because in 1909 they've just laid down a Dante Alighieri. Woohoo! Aren't they happy? And they're also having fun because, quite literally, Giovanni Giletti, this gentleman, wins the election in March 1909 and then is replaced by Sidney Sonny. But Giletti's party has 329 out of 528 seats in Parliament, so guess he's really calling the shots. We've caused him to fall down, yes, but he's still leader of his party, he's still the most powerful member of his party, and he has 329 out of 528 seats in Parliament, so if he says no, it's no. What's really weird is they go from Rear Admiral Carlo Mirabello, this gentleman, who is probably the most trusted, most honest man in naval procurement and in naval politics and in the least political in the entirety of the Navy and most trusted by all sides, to Admiral Giovanni Bertolo, who is, well, he's political as long as the day is long. And all are answering to Victor Emmanuel III. Italy's also in a scenario where they are looking up. They're looking for their nationhood. And the thing, these countries, they're building themselves up. They want to be great power status. And for them, great power status is having a great navy. So again, why? What does a treaty bring to them? What does a treaty enable them to have? What does it support them for? Think about these men. Not one of them is for naval disarmament. Not one of them believes in anything but the strongest Italy can be. Every single one of them thinks now that Italy's united, it deserves its place in the sun. It deserves its position in the world. Italy, the inheritor of Rome. i.e. the Roman Empire. Mare Nostrum and etc. is often things we associate with the fascisti and with Mussolini, but honestly, it's got some strong threads going in the early 1900s, and it's definitely there in 1909. Italy's proud of its past, and it's proud of its present. In 1909, Germany. Okay. It's the first of the extra countries you're going to have in this naval treaty, because you can't just have a treaty between the Japanese, the French, the Italians, the Americans, and the Brits in 1909. No, you've got to get Kaiser Wilhelm and Bernhard von Bollow on board. Oh, and Alfred Tirpitz. Alfred von Tirpitz. And Admiral Friedrich Graf von Bundesch. And Max von Fischl. You've got to get all these people, and then of course when Bullow's replaced by Theobald von Beffen-Holweg, again, you have got to get all these people on side with a naval treaty, because if Germany doesn't join a treaty and they keep building with abandon, what's the chances of Britain joining the treaty? Not happening. Now the thing is, a suitable global stage with enough of a global standing, and you can guarantee Kaiser Wilhelm will show up, because his ego demands it. Some men spend their lives compensating for, well, let's say their third leg. Wilhelm spends his life compensating for the fact that he's got a damaged hand and various other issues. He spends his life compensating for it. Not sure if ever he managed to achieve compensation. Tirpitz, just think about his reaction. All the effort he's put into the navy laws, all the effort he's put into building up a fleet, all the antagonism he's incurred with Britain and everywhere else in the world to try and get Germany its place in the sun, and now you want to have a treaty? Believe it or not, though, there is also part of Germany which is possibly keen on the idea, and that would be the army. If you could get the Heer on board with the idea of a naval treaty, so that the Navy wasn't asking for any more funding, they'd probably accept it. But whether or not they could persuade the Kaiser to accept it is another matter. And again, what's the advantage? What's the point? In 1922, it's framed as preventing another world war, where they're worried about Britain versus America because of the ongoing qualitative race going on between the two. But basically, it's also because everyone wants to make spending cuts for various reasons. The Americans, because they just want to cut spending on the Navy. That's just Congress's default, is cut the Navy. It's kind of like their current default is fund upgrades for the B-52. Their default is cut naval spending in this period. For Britain, it's because they now want to build a land fit for heroes and establish the beginnings of the welfare state and various other things. You know, the French need to rebuild their entire nation after pouring so much of their civilization into a war, a meat grinder of a war. Germany is much the same. You know, there are lots of reasons why these things work post World War I, but those conditions don't exist in 1909. They don't exist at all. And then we have Russia. Russia's literally just laid down the gang guts. And think about how big Russia is at this point, how powerful they project themselves to be. We're talking about Imperial Russia. We're talking about Nicholas II, the Tsar. We're talking Peter Stolpen, the Prime Minister at the time. We're talking Naval Minister being Vice Admiral Stefan Andreyevich Vorovsky. These men do not want a naval treaty. They want a navy. They don't want a treaty to bring about peace. They want to crush the Japanese. They want to crush the Germans. They want to crush anyone so that they can show they're still strong. They are Russia. You need to fear them. And currently, at this point, 4 years after the Battle of Tsushima, they don't feel like they can project that unless they build a lot. So you honestly think you can... Does anyone honestly think they can persuade them for a naval treaty? I keep trying to emphasize in this period it isn't really an option because of all the different powers involved. And the thing is, I haven't even listed this power yet. And I'm going to. And I can't believe it, but it's coming up. And I should probably risk China and the Ottoman Empire and Greece as well. But honestly, at certain points, you have to limit how many people you're talking about, because otherwise it's just going to be a long list of, and this power wouldn't want it for this reason and this reason, and I just sound repetitive. But yeah, let's go for Austro-Hungary. Right then, so you try and figure out the government structure as it will apply. There is theoretically someone who's in charge of the imperial household and serves as a foreign minister and all these things, and theoretically they'd be involved. But because Austria and Hungary basically try to run as separate states and have a very interesting, complicated government, it's also going to depend upon the relationships between those ministers, who exactly gets involved. I spent a good solid 2 days going through the leadership and trying to figure out exactly what the relationship would be. In the end, I can tell you who is the naval officer involved, and I can tell you who the emperor is involved. The rest is going to depend on exactly who gets approached and exactly what politics are in play at that precise time. Because whilst there are people on paper, the government doesn't work like that. It really doesn't. It really doesn't. Now, the thing is, the admiral involved, Rudolf Montecuccoli, who I've already done videos about in the past, and is probably one of the most interesting and persuasive characters in Austrian history. He's also the man who managed to get battleships ordered quite literally on his own cognizance. The Tegetovs, to get them ordered, he basically signs the contracts for them before he's got the money agreed by the ministry, let alone by the parliaments, so he can get the ships built. That's how focused he is on building up a strong Austrian navy. The question is, what would they demand in any treaty? So, when we're faced with all this, all these different powers and what they would want, you're left with a real problem. I cannot emphasize this more. The chance of naval history repeating itself early and having a naval treaty in 1909 is nil, as things stand historically. As things stand historically. The reality is you have too many vested interests who are supporting the promotion of navies. You have too much national ideology wrapped up with the strength of the navies. You have too much status wrapped up with the strength of the navies. Navies are critical. Navies are what you have, and the strength of your navy is measured in your battle fleet. And what we're talking about is trying to implement some sort of treaty system at a time when people are just starting to turn from one generation, one style of battleship, to the next style of battleship. And that's the really big problem, because no one really knows what they need. You know, when they make decisions, as we've often said on this channel, when we talk about Washington deciding to go with a 35,000 ton limit for your battleships, for your capital ships, everyone knows there's about 5,000 tons too little to produce what everyone really wants. And standard. But it's capable. It's capable of producing something which will work. The thing is, it's not what you want to be building, but you're going to accept building with that one. You can make it work. But in this period, what are we going to go with? You know, the battleships available at this point, they're not that big. The Orion class, they are 22,274 tons in normal, officially. That's what, 20-something thousand tons in standard? That's just... Once you take out feed, water, and fuel, and considering the thousands of tons worth of fuel, they carry roughly 3,000 tons worth of fuel. You know, maybe you're talking something about which is as little as 19,000 tons. Everyone knows they're getting bigger. They got 13.5-inch guns are the biggest guns out there, and they aren't even yet in service. Everyone's got 12-inch guns at this point. And everyone's doing a lot of research into making bigger guns. And the armaments industries are, in some cases, keeping the national economies afloat and working. In terms of the employment they create, in terms of the research and science they're bringing about. For all the powers in this period, getting a naval treaty, as we understand naval treaties historically, is not going to be viable. If you went with a second London style treaty, you have maybe more of a chance. Maybe more of a chance. But there aren't really those options in history, because the nations didn't see it as necessarily a threat. Arms races come and go. There had been arms races before. That's the whole warrior ironclad arms race. The whole who has the biggest first-rate arms race, which comes along in the 1820s. All sorts of things. They had happened before. They were part of the human condition. They were part of what nation-states had to deal with. They understood it. And they'd had some treaties, and they did have some international agreements in place, but the concept of putting together such a framework, such a treaty system, whilst it has been mooted, there were people who did moot various ideas of such things, really hasn't had any thought of its practical implementation, how they'd make it work. And that's the other thing. Do any of the nations we've talked about trust the others enough to believe that they will implement it honestly, or even relatively honestly? Think about all the powers you've got to get involved. And it's not just the 5 we normally talk about that were historically involved in naval treaties post-World War I. We're talking about adding in Russia, Austria-Hungary, because you have to. They are major world powers with major navies who are going to be investing, and if you don't add them in, they're going to be escape clauses for others. There's arguments you should be adding in Spain, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, the Ottoman Empire, Greece, Australia, perhaps, as it's got its own, wants its own ships. And that's the problem again, because you can make the rationalizations post-World War I, to get it down to a manageable number of nations that you can try to reach some compromise between. But prior to World War One, and I didn't even include Germany in that list, the ones who are going to grandstand, who are going to be, you can guarantee whatever his diplomats sort out, whatever world-class ideas his people come up with, Kaiser Wilhelm will want to stick his great big ego into it. And we just know that man will manage to muck things up with his ego. We know it. Because look at the diplomacy every time. It's his grandstanding ego which leads to Germany's greatest fallouts in the diplomatic stage. So when he's trying to do things in North Africa, that the Royal Navy does its full over in the middle of the night, turns up, and next morning everyone's looking out, all the diplomats are looking out going, "Oh, frigate, the entire Mediterranean squadron, the fleet's here." Well, the Royal Navy, that's a lot of ships, and they arrived in the middle of the night, and they have just arrived here, and they're all looking very well dressed and very organised, and there's a very senior admiral in charge. Oh, frigate. And that caused problems for Germany, it did. A naval treaty where you've got Wilhelm's ego trying to write checks which his country really doesn't want to follow through on. There's honestly a possibility of it leading to civil war. I've done it before. I've talked about how the fight between the Navy and the Army was seriously threatening to a lot of the internal politics in Germany. In this scenario, if the Army is pushing for it, and that's the way I can see it happening, is that the Army is pushing for it to try and limit spending in some way, and Wilhelm misjudges it, Wilhelm could end up causing himself a lot of serious trouble. Possibly the traditional, nobility will, and that it do give the Army, a lot of its senior officers will hold it and stop it going an outright civil war against him, but it could also lead to him being humbled, which does offer some interesting opportunities for potentially diverting World War One, but we'll leave that to one side. The reality is, any naval treaty you put through has got to involve compromise. It's going to involve compromise from all parties. The question you have to ask yourself is, which of these powers are actually prepared to compromise, and to what extent? And more importantly, are they prepared to compromise enough to make others feel safe making their compromises? Would Japan and Russia really accept the same strength? After all, Russia would go, but we need a navy in the North Sea, in the Northern Fleet, in the Baltic, we need a navy in the Black Sea, we need a navy in the Pacific. Britain would go, we need a fleet in the Indian Ocean, a fleet in the Mediterranean, a fleet in the North Atlantic for the home fleet, and we need squadrons in the Caribbean. All these things become pretty darn problematic. But I did start thinking, and with all this discussion going on, I didn't want to just do a whole video of just going, no, it's not possible because of this, it's not possible because of this, it's not possible because of the personalities involved, it's not possible because of the national interests involved. I wanted to think through, was there an actual chance? And that's what we're going to be discussing after Shameless Book Plug. So, it's Shameless Book Plug time, and for those who don't realise it, this is the point where I say thank you for your support, thank you for your super chat, super thanks, your liking, your sharing, subscribing, you're doing all the stuff you do which helps the channel grow and helps me sustain the channel. Without it, it wouldn't be where it is. Without Patreon, I wouldn't have these fun questions to work through, even one which, honestly, the thought of trying to get Kaiser Wilhelm to a naval conference and naval treaty almost makes my head cry out in absolute anguish, but we'll leave that to one side. It's thank you. It's thanks to all of your support as possible. And this is my book, which is currently out. As an academic, and my career rises and falls with my books. So, I do a little bit of shameless book plugging because, well, ain't no one else can advertise it but me. More books coming soon, hopefully. Everything's working on that. But with that, let's get into this discussion. So what is this option? What am I going to be saying? Well, first of all, we have to consider the fleet as it was laid down in this period. What was actually viably possible? What ships were actually doing? I don't think you would get a treaty based on the latest build. You wouldn't even get a treaty based on the future, on the current under construction. You might be able to get a treaty based on something like a 25,000 ton standard displacement, but you would need something of the concept of standard displacement because the empires are not going to go for anything which means their fuel and their feed water, which is necessary to protect their empire and protect themselves around the world, is going to be limited. Now, what am I thinking of a treaty based along lines of? Well, it does start with the London Naval Treaty, but there seems to me be a chance or a possibility here. You see, if Roosevelt wants a bigger navy, he's got to get it through Congress, and he's got to deal with people like Tillman, who want to stop spending so much money on capital ships so you can start spending money on cruisers, because that would mean they can be built in the Charleston Navy Yard. Now, the thing is, no one's going to get away with a scenario whereby you are limiting the numbers of ships you can build. No one's going to be able to push that through in this period, because what's the ratio going to be? Is Britain going to insist on a ratio where it's as great, as powerful, it's allowed to have as many ships as the next two nations combined? No. So as said, ratios are completely out from the get-go. But that doesn't mean there's not a treaty available. You see, one of the things you have going on in this period is a fear about the growth in the size of ships and whether you're going to be able to have enough ships. You have the Liberal government in Britain would like to save money where it can do. And so would other nations. You see, if you want to order a large fleet, if you want to build a large fleet, realistically you need to be able to predict the cost. If you can get a fleet agreed whereby everyone is limited to ships of, let's say, 25,000 ton standard and 12-inch guns, or maybe 14-inch guns, then you've got a chance. One of the interesting things is, once you don't have a quantitative limit on ships in terms of numbers, you can build as many as you like. Realistically, your limitations for any form of writing up of a listing of going, well, this is a cruiser, this is a battleship, etc., go out the window. Because, let's say, cruisers are limited to this tonnage, but you can build as many battleships of a far greater tonnage as you want. So I can just say, well, I'm building a light battleship, not a cruiser, if you even bother with it. The moment you don't have a limit in either total tonnage you're able to construct, or in terms of number of ships you're able to construct, there is suddenly no advantage to having limitations below. So the naval treaty you could be talking about would be a limit of the largest ships you can build are 25,000 ton standard displacement and 14-inch guns. That is the limit to what you could do. But the problem is that's not really going to solve your problem much, because you're going to have issues. Now, if you without a quantitative limit, just trying to put a qualitative limit in, what you basically will have happen is, barring probably destroyers and other vessels like that, flotilla vessels, you'll basically mean that the criteria for your large ships are going to dominate your production. Whatever level you set as, 25,000 tons or whatever you pick in standard displacement, 14-inch guns, everything is going to be. And you turn every race into a straight-up numbers race. Every race into a straight-up numbers race. You see, with that kind of limitation, where you remove qualitative advancement, you turn every naval race in the world into a quantitative one, which is to the advantage of the bigger powers. And that's a problem again, because any of the smaller powers looking at that know, well, they're going to lose that. They're going to simply be outbuilt. Even the Germans, for whom it would absolutely satisfy Tirpitz, it would satisfy the army because they could fix their sums and work out what they're building, they would quickly find themselves in trouble in that scenario. Because whilst they can build those vessels, and they can work out the sums and they can advance it, if the British are not being stopped by having to make qualitative advancements to counter the Japanese, American, and Italians and what they're building and planning, then that speeds up British production. Also, as we all know, if you're all limited to the same thing, you might as well build larger classes, and larger classes tend to result in overall cheaper ships. The cost benefits of scale. Economies of scale, as we often call it, but it's technically, in this period, it's cost benefits of scale. You also have the problem that it allows powers who have, let's put it this way, limitations in terms of their qualitative capabilities to catch up and equal. And it probably does shift the competition elsewhere. The scenario I could see it doing, if you did get such a treaty through somehow in 1909 and did have some sort of limitation implemented, is the competition would quickly become speed of ships. How fast can we make them? Because, again, when you think about warships and their capabilities and the capabilities of their guns, well, guns, you have three options for making them more capable. You make them longer, you make them bigger, you make the shell larger, heavier, more powerful. Those are your three methods of making a gun better. How do you make a ship better? Well, you make it bigger. Can't do that. Make its guns more powerful. Can't really do that, and if we're limited in tonnage, there's only so many we can carry, and carry an effective fire load for them as well. Make its armor better. Should already be working on that, but again, limitation displacement, limitation of size. Only so much you can put on it. Speed. Power density. In many ways, the easiest thing to work up the curve of. The point is, you push through this scenario, and there is a possibility of this scenario if, Roosevelt, Tillman want to build as many ships as possible, and the way to build it is to stop having the advancements. They see Dreadnought coming in, they're worried about there being another race like after Warrior. They know that America, etc., keep arguing with the Senate. It's going to be difficult to continue wrangling. And so for different reasons, the Republicans and the Democrats both come behind it. You could see them pushing for it. For each nation, there are some advantages. For Britain, again, it allows them to race ahead. It allows them to come up with a design and just keep churning it out. They don't have to keep rethinking the design. They can just copy and paste, maybe minorly improved. Which is pretty much what they were doing already with each generation, but imagine if they don't have to move on between the generations. And also, they've got the 13.5-inch gun. Now, the thing is, how much does that save in weight versus the 14-inch gun? Especially in terms of the number of shells you're carrying. Is it worthwhile? Is the penetration capability to firepower so much less that it's worthwhile upgrading to 14-inch? Or is it better to upgrade the 13.5-inch gun? So we start off with the scenario is the Americans, basically the political parties, would have to come together, would have to decide that this is something they're going to push for because it strengthens their overall capabilities and allows them to keep a better handle on the costs. And stops Tillman having to ask the question of, how big a ship are you eventually going to ask me for? And for Roosevelt, it means he can order more ships, because he can provide a very good long forecast of what these ships are going to be. It's useful. For Britain, it removes a cost. It makes it easier for them. Easier to focus on other assets. They're probably one of the few navies that even in this scenario would keep building cruisers. But again, what tonnage would your cruisers grow to if you've got 25,000 tons as your limit for ships? And again, that's going to be the same across for battle cruisers. Royal Navy probably is churning out both, and that's going to be interesting. For Japan, well, again, it helps their industry in a way. It means they can concentrate on developing their industry and infrastructure to support this level of ship, and then they can churn it out. It's larger and more powerful than anything they existing have. It stops them worrying about other powers using their industrial might to bring something bigger. So now they need to concentrate on getting as many as they can and trying to find another X factor. Something else they can use for their capabilities. There are options out there, but again, they're limited. For the French, they don't lay down the Corvair till 1910. They have commissioned the Danton in 1911 and the Verite in 1908. They are in no good place. Honestly, as long as you can get the Italians and the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans to sign up to this, it's in their interest. And might be just enough that their warring factions of a political system can actually come together to work it out. Possibly. The thing is, I don't really see this working as a treaty system, longer term. Again, I don't see it working with the Regia Marina. For them, there are advantages for it. It allows them to just concentrate on building their ships. But one of the advantages they often seek is to have the best ships they can possibly build, is to upgrade them, is to make them more powerful. Because Italy is the original, we are a major power, but we've not got enough infrastructure to be a major power. And even our government, as crazy as it might seem, realizes that. So what we need to do is to play to our strengths, and our strengths are producing, well, their strengths are producing Ferrari. Their strengths are producing Lamborghini. Their strength is producing high quality things. Not vast numbers of things. Not at this time. Fiat is a long way away in 1909 from being the company it is today. That's the reality of the problem that Italy is facing. So for them, in some ways, it's great, and they can build a 25,000 design which is entirely built around the Mediterranean structure and can be a really great design for the Mediterranean. But oh my. For the Germans, well, finding Navy laws start to make sense. You see, Navy laws where you're writing in law what your fleet is going to be, and you're basing that fleet, as Tirpitz often admitted, on a ratio of what you needed to act as a risk fleet for the Royal Navy, to prevent them from interfering in whatever you were doing. Yeah, it helps to have a fixed point. But the thing is, those ships are still going to be expensive. And again, what are you going to pick as your qualities? As happened historically with treaty systems, if you have a 25,000 ton standard displacement limit, what are going to be your compromises? Are you going to want a slower ship so you can have it more heavily armoured? Which comes with other issues. Do you try and go for a ship with lower freeboard? So you can have it as a smaller hull overall, so you can try and you have to armour less area. But that could be complicate your sea operations, your naval operations, especially in the North Sea. Are you going to restrict your guns? Are you going to keep with 11-inch or 12-inch? Rather than going up to the 13.5, 14-inch? Would Kaiser Wilhelm allow you to? Would he allow you to? For Russia, they just started the Gangutz. They literally have just started the Gangutz. They have laid down 6 in 1909. That's a good start. Especially when you consider, when you look at the Ganga class and their size and their capabilities, and you look at what they're built for, well, you're talking 24,800 tons overall. That's TONNES. You're looking at a fairly decent top speed of 24 knots on trials, probably 22, 21 knots in reality in operations, when they're not light and when they've got their guns actually fitted. But they've got 12-inch guns, so for them, it's a godsend. They can keep building those ships and they have something good. They have something capable. They have something which works. But the problem is, they want more than those ships. They want better than those ships. They want vessels which will help them in the Pacific. They want vessels which will give them the firepower they need to wage the kind of naval wars they need to wage. And that's the problem. Because to get those ships, they're going to need bigger ships than 25,000 tons. To have ships which can allow them to move their fleet, even if it's a standard displacement figures, not including fuel and water, to have a fleet which can readily deploy and concentrate from the Pacific to the Northern Fleet and the Baltic and the Black Sea, or vice versa, so they can really deliver power where they need to. That's going to require a lot of space be allocated to things like food, fuel and water. And the thing is, even if the fuel and water doesn't count towards your standard displacement, the protection for it does. Do you want your fuel and water to be unarmored? Well, water you can maybe get away with, but fuel? Unarmored fuel on a battleship? No protection for your fuel tanks? Doesn't sound sensible, does it? Doesn't sound sensible. And you can have some fuel tanks which are unarmored, but they're usually the ones you want to use up quite quickly on, early on in your voyage, and that also then presents a problem of those tanks then become tanks of fumes, and fumes are even more reactive than fuel. So usually you don't like it. But I could see them still. going with this treaty. Because again, it reduces their costs. It reduces their infrastructure. You see, the main advantage with any form of naval treaty in this period, and I said the only sort of treaty you could get through is an overall limitation of no one will build something bigger than 25,000 tons and this size gun, is that it flattens the playing field. It flattens the playing field. And that matters. Because it's not a long time before the Queen Elizabeth class come along, and they're preceded by the Iron Dukes, which were 25,000 tons, 29,500 tons fully loaded. The Queen Elizabeth class, they're 32,500 tons. 34,000 tons pretty much fully loaded, or deep load. There's a quantum difference between them and the ships we're talking about in this period, and it's not that far away. The Queen Elizabeths are ordered in 1911, 1912. They're laid down in 1912. The designs have been going through for that. So we're talking a couple years beyond this point. They're talking about Queen Elizabeth. That's how quickly the battleships accelerate in size. That's how quickly the qualitative race grows to ships. That's your problem. The fact is, Dreadnought hasn't just unleashed a new concept of battleship, it's unleashed a whole new, or rather is the starting point for a whole new generation of naval architecture. An evolution of design which allows the battleships to grow this big. And a treaty in this period is attempting to put that particular genie back in its bottle. And the problem is, even if you do succeed, I don't know how long you actually succeed for. How long before a nation breaks it? How long before a nation realizes it's starting to get completely outmatched numerically by its opponents and seeks a qualitative remedy to that solution, that problem? Because that's how you balance quantity. Normally, as a small power, you go for quality. Only the largest powers can balance quality and quantity. Large powers who have great girth but not necessarily great depth, they will go for quantity. Smaller powers, to balance those powers who will tend to be focused on them, will tend to have to focus on quality. Spain. All sorts of powers would need to probably be included in this treaty to make it work. And that adds a whole other dimension of discussion. Because that's the other problem you have with all this. Even if you do get these nations to agree, are they going to agree to a clause that none of them will build ships bigger than this for another nation asking for a third party, which isn't a signatory? I.e., the Brazils, the Argentinas, the Chiles, the Ottomans, the Greeks of this world. So you have to make sure those powers are signatories, otherwise you can't control it. There is enough incentive, there is enough there that you could possibly get through a treaty like this. Do I think it would solve anything? No. Do I think it would eventually collapse because someone resorts to building something which is far bigger, and you probably cover up what they're building as being one of the regular ships right up until the moment they can't cover it anymore. Probably building a larger ship and claim it's a battle cruiser, which has got virtually no armor and virtually no guns or something, up until they actually know it's a battleship and it's 40,000 tons. Alternatively, the British go county class earlier on, i.e. the concept of it's fitted for but not with its armour belt. But it's less than 25,000 ton standard. That's also going to be the problem, because again, without World War One as the incentive, as the boogeyman, as the thing you're trying to keep behind the water door because you don't want to let it out again, what is the real threat of cheating? We're talking about nations who haven't experienced a global war for over a century at this point. And I'm talking a major global conflict, a conflict which actually had risk for them as a nation. Yes, Russia and Japan had a big fight, and for Japan especially, it was terrifying. But the other powers, they haven't since the Napoleonic Wars. And that was a couple of generations ago. Most importantly, a couple of generations of leaders ago. It's not going to happen. Or rather, if they are building these ships, if they are limited that way, they are going to get very incredibly creative. Water as armor? Oh, that's going to come in early on. That is going to come in very early on. I'm not sure who will get to it first, but someone will. Probably one of the nations which has to carry a lot of armor, so does some testing with their water tanks and goes, oh, you know what? That worked. And so this is the point at which I go, what's today's question? What is today's question? Well, today's question is going to be quite simple. What do you think would happen in a scenario where you get some form of treaty giving you a cap on about a ship size of 25,000 tons, and let's say they ran up the 13.5 inch of the Orions to 14-inch guns? What do you think happens in the world? How long do you think it lasts for? How long do you think it holds any weight for? I'd be really interested to know what you think. I'd be really interested because, as I said, I honestly don't believe it lasts for long. I honestly think it would collapse very, very quickly. Anyway. With that being said, what do we have coming next? Well, it's the Paulette affair. Now, in the nicest way, I am really, really stupid when it comes to my YouTube channel. If I'm actually trying to maximize the number of people looking at it, I really should go for more popular naval history topics and do some more popular things. But I like the subject of doing courses, and I like doing stuff which, frankly, sometimes people haven't heard about. So if you haven't heard about the Paulette affair, and you haven't heard of Admiral Richard Thomas, please look him up. He's one of those forgotten officers in the British history. He's one of those forgotten officers forgotten events in the world's history, and he matters. And it's an interesting one because I keep getting questions about what happens if Britain decides it wants to hold on to Hawaii. Well, this is a 5-month period when unofficially Britain did take over Hawaii. And because the British government didn't want it, and because most of the Navy didn't want it, Richard Darton Thomas, the commander of the Pacific Station, had to work out a way for the British to save face and concede, at the same time in a way which would also not make the Americans get too egotistical and other people think they really were weak. And he managed to pull it off. He managed to pull it off because he managed to get enough concessions from the Americans that the issues which had originally led to the occupation were dealt with. It took years to dissolve the final ends of the dispute and to sort everything out, but the thing was, it managed to make everything done in a way which was useful and was built positive relationships. One of the fun things that often comes from it is that people often go, well, the American warships arrived and the British backed off. The British only withdraw on the orders of Thomas, who is aboard HMS Dublin, which was a very nice 74-gun third-rate ship of the line, which had been launched in 1812. The American vessels involved were the USS United States, which was a heavy frigate, and the USS Constellation, also quite a tough frigate. There was already another British frigate there, of course, the original vessel there. So, sorry to tell people this, but the Americans did not exactly turn up with overwhelming force. They turned up and showed their interest, but the British had enough force there to carry it in the initial fight at least. But it's an interesting thing to view how it is, because the British government really don't want Hawaii. No one wants Hawaii. They've been dragged into getting involved in it, and how they resolve it, and how they save face, and how Richard Thomas works this all is really a masterclass in naval diplomacy. And it's a really interesting video. Well, hopefully will be. I'm going to record it next Monday, because the version I've already got recorded I don't like, so I'm going to re-record it next Monday. Hopefully it'll go up on Tuesday on time. Thank you very much for watching, and take care.